Meet George Washington. Chapter 1 of the Landmark Books by Joan Heilbroner. George Washington was the first president of the United States of America. He was a great American general. Many people think he was the greatest American who ever lived. But George Washington was not born an American. He was born an Englishman. George Washington was born in Virginia in the year of 1732. In 1732, Virginia was an English colony. It belonged to England, and it was ruled by the King of England. The people of Virginia felt that they were English. There were 13 English colonies in America when Washington was a boy. Each colony had its own part of the land. Each had its own churches and its own soldiers, and each had its own kind of farms. In Virginia, the farmers grew tobacco. They had slaves to do the work, and tobacco made many Virginia farmers rich. George Washington's father was a rich Virginia farmer. In many ways, he lived like an English gentleman. He wore English clothes. He rode English horses. He had fine things from England in his house. He even sent his older sons to school in England. He wanted them to learn the ways of English gentlemen. George's father owned about 50 slaves, and he owned 3 farms on the Potomac River. George Washington lived on all these farms as a little boy, but when George was 7, the Washingtons moved to a new farm on the Rappahannock River. They called it Ferry Farm. Chapter 2. Reading, Writing, and Rules. Soon after the Washingtons moved to Ferry Farm, George went to school. His father did not send him to school in England like his brothers. George learned reading and arithmetic and handwriting. He worked hard on his writing. He wanted it to look good. George learned writing by copying from books. He had a book of rules for young gentlemen. He copied all the rules. "Sit not when others stand," wrote George. "Sleep not when others speak," and "Spit not in the fire." These were the rules that young gentlemen learned in those days. There were 110 of them. George learned many things outside of school, too. He learned to fish, he learned to swim, and he learned how to use a gun. He liked to hunt for ducks along the river. George was a tall, strong boy. He became good at all kinds of sports. Before long, he could run faster than any of his friends, and he soon learned to ride a horse better than anyone his age. In a few years, he would be called the best rider in Virginia. When George was 10, his older brother, Lawrence, came back to Virginia to live. Lawrence was a soldier. He had gone to fight for the English in a war with Spain. Lawrence talked about the battles he had fought in. He talked about far-off lands. George liked to hear about these things. George looked up to his soldier brother, and Lawrence liked his little brother George. They did many things together. This was a happy year for George Washington, but the next year was a sad one. When George was 11, his father died. Chapter 3. George Grows Up. George was only a boy when his father died, but he grew up fast. When he was 14, he was as strong as a man. He wanted to go to sea, but his mother did not want him to go to sea, and George soon found other work to do. George became a surveyor. A surveyor measures land and makes maps of land. There was a great need for surveyors in the colonies. Many farmers were buying new lands in the west of Virginia, so George made many trips to the west. Few people lived in the west of Virginia. There were miles of woods between farms. George often had to sleep in the woods. He had to shoot wild ducks for his supper. He cooked them over a fire. This was not like the easy life at Ferry Farm, but George liked this kind of living, and he soon learned to be a good surveyor. In these years, George went often to see his brother Lawrence. Lawrence had married soon after his father died. He lived on a farm called Mount Vernon. Life was gay at Mount Vernon. There were many parties and balls. George wore fine new coats and white silk stockings. He danced with the young ladies of Virginia. George Washington loved to dance. George had many happy times at Mount Vernon, but when George was 20, Lawrence became ill. George took Lawrence to the island of Barbados. He hoped that Lawrence would get well there, but he never got well again. he came home to Mount Vernon to die. This story of George Washington as a child is read from the Stories of Great Americans for Little Americans by Edward Eggleston. Washington and his Hatchet. It was Arbor Day in the Mossy Hill School, and Johnny Littlejohn had to speak a piece that had something to do with trees. He thought it would be a good plan to say something about the little cherry tree that Washington spoiled with his hatchet when he was a little boy. This is what he said. He had a hatchet, little George, a hatchet bright and new, and sharp enough to cut a little stick in two. He hacked and whacked and whacked and hacked, the sturdy little man. He hacked a log and hacked a fence as round as he ran. He hacked his father's cherry tree, and made an ugly spot. The bark was soft, the hatchet sharp, and little George forgot. You know the rest. The father frowned and asked the reason why. You know the good old story runs, he could not tell a lie. The boy that chopped the cherry tree soon grew to be a youth. At work and books he hacked away, and still he told the truth. The youth became a famous man, above 6 feet in height, and when he had good work to do, he hacked with all his might. He fought the armies that the king had sent across the sea. He batted down the land to set his country free. He batted up and down the land to set his country free. For 7 long years he hacked and whacked with all his might and main, until the British sailed away and did not come again. This next book is The Life of George Washington in Words of One Syllable by Josephine Pollard. I'm going to read chapters 1, Boyhood, and chapter 2, Youth. The Life of George Washington. George Washington was born in the state of Virginia at a place known as Bridges Creek on February 22, 1732. His great-grandsire, John Washington, came from England in the year 1657 and took up lands in the state and was a rich man. George was the son of his grandson, Augustine. Augustine's first wife was Jane Butler, who died and left him with 2 boys. His next wife was Mary Ball, and George was her first child. The old homestead in which George was born stood near the banks of the Potomac River, and was built with a steep roof that sloped down to the low eaves that hung out far from the main wall. There were 4 rooms on the ground floor, and some near the roof, and at each end of the house was a great fireplace built of brick, with broad hearthstones such as were in the style of those days. A stone is all that marks the birth of George Washington. He was not more than 8 years of age when his father went to live on a farm near the Rappahannock River. The house was built much in the same style as the one at Bridges Creek, but it stood on high ground, and here all his boyhood days were spent. As there were no good schools in America at that time, those who had the means sent their sons to England to be taught and trained. Lawrence Washington was sent when he was 15 years of age, and as he was the firstborn, it was thought that he would in time take his father's place as the head of the house. The school to which George was sent stood in a field on his father's land. He was taught by a man named Hobby. This gave it the name of the Hobby School. There were but 3 things taught there: how to read, how to write, and how to do sums, and some folks thought that these were all their boys and girls had need to learn. Books were scarce and dear, and as most of the men raised fine crops and kept up a brisk trade, they were well pleased to have their boys learn how to buy and sell, and to make out bills. George had been trained by his father, who was a strict and yet a just man, to love the truth and to do right at all times. He was made to feel that it was a sin to tell a lie, and much worse to hide a fault than to own it. George had a small axe of which he was quite proud, and boylike he cut right and left with it, and thought not of the harm he might do. On the lawn stood a small tree which his father had hoped to see grow up to a good height and to bear fine fruit. George made a great gash in this tree with his sharp axe, and when his father saw it, he was quite sad. He called the boy to his side, and in a stern voice said, "Who did this? Who cut this tree?" George hung his head with shame. He knew he had done wrong, and he stood in fear of his father, who he knew would use the rod where there was need of it. It was a chance for the boy to show what kind of stuff he was made of. George raised his face, still red with a blush of shame, and said in his frank way, and without a sign of fear, "I did it, father. I cannot tell a lie." There was no need to use the rod on such a boy as that. And the father must have felt the thrill of joy when he found that the great truths he had taught his son had such a hold on his mind and had struck their roots deep into his heart. So George told the truth to his father, even though he knew that he was probably going to be spanked with a rod. But he would rather not be a liar, and that's what made his father proud. And that's why his father knew that he didn't have to spank him. It is told that he clasped George to his breast and said with tears in his eyes that it would grieve him less to lose scores and scores of trees than to have his boy tell just one lie. But you must not think that George Washington was such a good boy that he could guide himself and did not need to be kept in check. He was high-strung, as quick as a flash, and felt that he was born to rule, and these traits his mother had to keep down and to train so that they would not wreck the young boy. For when George was not yet 12 years of age, his father died, and his mother was left with the care of 5 young folks. The task was one for which she was well fit, as she had a rare good sense, a fine mind, a strong will, and a kind heart. She used to read to her boys and girls each day out of some good book, talk with them, and tell them how they could best serve God and man. And George laid up each word in his heart and sought to pay her back as well as he could for all her kind love and care. She said of George that he was a good boy, and it has been said in her praise that a noble mother must have borne so brave a son. When George was 13 and his half-brother Lawrence 21, England and Spain went to war, and Lawrence went with the troops that were sent to the West Indies. The sight of Lawrence in a warlike trim, the sound of drum and fife, and the march of troops through the streets fired the heart of the young lad, and from that time his plays and games and school and out took on a warlike turn. There was a boy at school named William Bustle, who took up arms and marched with as much zeal as George Washington, but George was at all times commander-in-chief. He was fond of the sports that boys love, and could run and jump and climb and toss bars, and took part in all those feats that kept him in health and strength. He could pitch quotes with great skill, and the places shown at Fredericksburg, where when a boy he flung a stone across the Rappahannock. He was fond of a horse, and there was no steed so wild that George could not mount on his back and tame him. Miss Washington had a colt which she thought so much of that she had let it run loose in the field. He was so fierce that no one had dared to get on his back. One day George went out to view the colt with some of his boy friends, and he told them that if they would help him put the bit in the colt's mouth, he would mount. The boys drove the colt, into a small lot and put the bit in his mouth, and Washington was soon on his back. The beast rushed into the field, but was soon curbed by the strong arms of the boy on his back. Then the colt reared and plunged and tried all sorts of ways to get rid of the lad, who clung to the colt's bare back, as if he had been glued there. Mad with rage, the colt tried more than once to throw him, but strained too hard and fell to the ground and died in a short time. The group of boys were well scared at the sad end of their fun, and scarce knew what to do. When they went back to the house, Miss Washington asked the boys if they had seen her fine breed of colts. "The one I am most proud of," said she, "I am told is as large as his sire." Some of the lads hung their heads and knew not what to say, but George spoke up in his frank way, and said that the colt was dead. "Dead!" cried she, "and from what cause?" Then George told her just what had been done, and how hard the beast had fought to get free, and how at last with one wild fierce plunge he fell down and died. A flush rose to his mother's cheek, and then she said to her boy, "It is well. But while I grieve at this loss of my fine colt, I feel a pride and joy in my son, who speaks the truth at all times." George was fond of his books, too, and was so wise a lad, and so full of thought, and had so keen a sense of what was just, that his schoolmates came to him when they got into a war of words or of blows, that he might say which side was right and which side was wrong, and thus put an end to the fight. This use of his mind made George look at things in a clear light, and gave him the look of true pride which all men of high mind, the real kings of earth, are wont to wear. In due time George outgrew the hobby school, and was sent to live with his half-brother Augustine at Bridges Creek, where there was a school of a high grade. But George had no taste for Latin or Greek, and liked best to do sums and to draw maps. He wrote with great care, page after page, of what he called forms of writing. These were notes of hand, bills of sale, deeds, bonds, and the like, such as one would think a boy of 13 would not care much about. In this same book, it is kept to this day, George wrote out 110 rules which were to guide him in act and speech at home and abroad. Some few of these I will give you, that you may see at how young an age this boy set out to train himself and fit himself for the high place he was to fill. It almost seems as if he must have known the high rank he was to take, but this could not be. His soul was fixed on high things. He had no low tastes, and he was led by the hand of God. Here are some of the rules that George Washington took as the guide of his youth. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers or feet. Sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Walk not when others stop. Turn not your back to others when speaking. Jog not to the table or desk on which another reads or writes. Lean not on anyone. Read no letters, books, or papers in company, but when there is need for doing it, you must ask leave. Come not near the books or writings of anyone so as to read them, unless asked to do so, nor give your opinion of them unasked. Also, look not nigh when another is writing a letter. In writing or speaking, give to each person his due title according to his rank and custom of the place. When a man does all he can, though it succeeds not well, blame not him that did it. Be slow to believe evil reports of anyone. Be modest in your dress, and to suit nature rather than to win admiration. Keep to the fashion of your equals, such as the civil and orderly with respect to time and places. Play not the peacock, looking all about you to see if you be well decked, if your shoes fit well, your stockings sit neatly, and your clothes handsomely. Make friends with those of good character, if you care for your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Speak not of doleful things in time or mirth, nor at the table. Speak not of mournful things as death and wounds, and if others mention them, change, if you can, the discourse. Utter not base and foolish things amongst grave and learned men, nor hard questions or subjects among the ignorant, nor things hard to be believed. Be not forward, but friendly, and courteous, the first to salute, hear and answer, and be not pensive when it is time to converse. Gaze not at the marks or blemishes of others, and ask not how they came. Think before you speak, pronounce not imperfectly, nor bring out your words too hastily, but orderly and distinctly. Treat with men at fit times about business, and whisper not in the company of others. Be not curious to know the affairs of others, nor go near those who speak in private. Undertake not to do what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise. Speak not evil in the absent, for it is unjust. Make no show of taking great delight in your food. Feed not with greediness. Cut your bread with a knife. Lean not on the table. Neither find fault with what you eat. When you speak of God, let it be gravely and in reverence. Honor and obey your parents, although they be poor. Let your amusements be manful, not sinful. Labor to keep alive in your breath that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. It is not known where George found these rules he took so much pains to write out, but it is plain that he set great store by them, and made use of them throughout his whole life. Chapter 2. Youth. George was a great pet with his brother Lawrence Washington, who thought it would be a nice thing for him to serve on board of one of the king's ships of war. While Lawrence was in the West Indies, he was on good terms with General Wentworth and Admiral Vernon, and he had no doubt that they would do their best to get his brother a good place. He spoke to George about it, and the boy was wild with joy. His mother's pride was roused, and at first she did not put a straw in his way, but gave him all the help she could. But as the time drew near, her heart, which had been so strong and brave and full of pride, gave way, and she felt she could not part with her dear boy. One of her friends wrote to Lawrence that Miss Washington had made up her mind not to let George go to sea. She said that some of her friends had told her it was a bad plan, and I find, said he, that one word against his going has more weight than 10 for it. So they gave up the scheme, and George was sent back to school. He would, on fine days, go out in the fields and tracts of land around the schoolhouse, and with line and rod take the size and shape, the length and width, and mark it all down in one of his little books. And so much pains did he take that from that first to the last page not a blot or blur is to be seen. These neat ways, formed in his youth, were kept up all his life, and what seems strange is that the day books, and such books you will find in great use nowadays, were not known at the time. The plan had been throughout by George Washington when a boy of 16, and shows the cast of his mind. Near this time George was sent to live with his brother Lawrence at his fine place on the Potomac, which he had called Mount Vernon, to show how much he had thought of the admiral of that name. Here George had a chance to make friends with those of high rank, and he spent much of his time with George Fairfax, who made his home at Belvoir, near Mount Vernon. Lord Fairfax was a man of wealth and was much at Belvoir at the time. He had bought large tracts of land in Virginia, which had not been staked out or set out off into lots. In fact, he did not know their size or shape, but he had heard that men had sought out some of the best spots, and had built homes there, and laid out farms for which they had paid no rent, and he thought it was quite time to put stop to such things. In March 1748, George Washington, who had been picked out by Lord Fairfax for this task, went on his first trip with George Fairfax to stake off these wild lands. He wrote down what was done from day to day, and by these notes we learn that he had quite a rough time of it, and yet found much that was to his taste. He and the men with him rode for miles and miles through lands rich in grain, hemp, and tobacco, and through fine groves of trees on the bank of a broad stream. One night, writes George, when they had been hard at work all day, they came to the house where they were to be fed and lodged. The woodmen went out to bed with their clothes on, but George took his off, and as he turned in he found his bed was of loose straw, and not a thing on it but the threadbare blanket he was to wrap himself in. The fleas and bugs soon forced George to get up and put on his clothes and lie, as the rest of the men did. And had we not been so tired, he says, I am not sure we should not have slept much that night. He made a vow then that he would sleep out of doors, near a fire, when on such tramps, and run no more such risks. On March 18th they reached a point on the Potomac which they were told they could not ford. There had been a great rainfall, and the stream had not been so high by 6 feet as it was at that time. They made up their minds to stay there for a day or two, and went to see the warm springs, and at night camped out on the field. At the end of 2 days, as the stream was still high, they swam their steeds to the Maryland side. The men crossed in birch-bark boats, and rode all the next day, in a rainstorm, to a place 20 miles high from where they had set out that morn. Washington writes that the road was the worst that had ever been trod by man or beast. On March 23rd they fell in with a score or two of red men who had been off to war and brought home but one scalp, and they had a chance to see a war dance. The red men cleared a large space and built a fire in the midst of it, round which they all sat. One of the men then made a grand speech in which he told them how they were to dance. When he had done, the one who could dance the best sprang up as if he had been roused from sleep, and ran and jumped around the ring in a queer kind of way. The rest soon joined him, and did just as he did. By the time the band made itself heard, and I shall have to tell you what a fine band it was, there was a pot half full of water, with a piece of deerskin stretched tight to the top, and a gourd with some shot in it, and a piece of horsetail tied to make it look fine. One of the men shook the gourd, and one drummed all the while the rest danced, and I doubt if you would care to hear the noise that was made. Late in the day of March 26th they came to a place where dwelt a man named Hedge, who was in the pay of King George as justice of the peace. Here they camped, and at that meal was spread. There was not a knife nor fork to eat with, but such as the guests had brought with them. On the night of the 1st of April the wind blew and the rain fell. The straw on which they lay took fire, and George was saved by one of the men who woke him when it was ablaze. "I had not slept for 4 nights in a bed," wrote Washington at this time to one of his young friends at home, "but when I have walked a good deal in the day I lie down on a heap of straw or a bearskin by the fire, with man, wife, young ones, dogs, and cats, and he is in luck who gets the place next the fire." For 3 years he kept up this mode of life, but as it was a hard life to lead, he could be out but a few weeks at a time. His pay was a doubloon a day, and sometimes 6 pistoles. A doubloon is a gold coin of Spain, worth not quite $16. A pistole is a small gold coin of Spain, worth not quite $4. This rough kind of life, though he did not know it, was to fit him for the toils and ills of war, of which he may have dreamt of in those days, as he still kept up his love of warlike things. While at work on the land round the Blue Ridge, he now and then made his way to Greenway Court, where Lord Fairfax dwelt at this time. Here he had a chance to read choice books, for Lord Fairfax had a fine mind, and though his tastes were queer, he lived on a knoll in a small house not more than 12 feet square. All round him were the huts for his help, black and whites. Red men, half-breeds, and woodmen thronged the place where they were sure they would get a good meal. He had steeds of fine breed and hounds of keen scent, for he was fond of the chase, and the woods and hills were full of game. Here was a grand chance for George, who had a great taste for field sports, and his rides and walks and talks with Lord Fairfax were a rich treat to the home-bred youth. This wise friend lent George good books, which he took with him to the woods and read with great care, and in this way stored his mind with rich thoughts. In Virginia there were some few men who had served in the late war twixt England and Spain, and they put George through such a drill with sword and with gun that he learned to use both with great skill. A Dutchman named Van Bram was one of these men, and he had claimed to know a great deal of the art of war. He it was that took George in hand to teach him the use of the sword and how to fence. When he was 19 years of age, the Red Men and the French had made such inroads on the front that it was thought best to place men on guard to keep back these foes, and to uphold the laws in the state of Virginia. There was need of someone to take charge of the school of arms at one of the chief outposts where the French sought to get a foothold, and the choice fell on George Washington, who was sent to work at once to fit himself for the place. His brother's ill health caused the scheme to be dropped for a time, as Lawrence was forced to go to the West Indies for change of air, and begged George to go with him. George gave up all thought of self, and the two set sail for Barbados, September 28, 1751. At sea he kept a log-book, took notes of the course of winds, and if the days were fair or foul, and learned all he could of the ways of a ship and how to sail one. They reached Barbados on November 3rd, and they were pleased with the place and all the strange sights that met their gaze. On all sides were fields of corn and sweet cane, and groves of trees rich in leaves and fruit, and all things held out a hope of a cure for the sick man, whose lungs were in a weak state. They had been but 2 weeks in Barbados when George fell ill with smallpox, and this for a time put an end to all their sports. But he had the best of care, and so at the end of 3 weeks was so well that he could go out of doors. Lawrence, soon tired of this place, longed for a change of scene, and they had to ride out by the first dawn of day, for by the time the sun was half an hour high it was hot as midday. There was no change in the sick man's health, and he made up his mind to go to Bermuda in the spring. He was lonesome without his wife, so it was planned that George should go back home and to bring her out to Bermuda. George set sail December 22nd and reached Virginia at the end of 5 weeks. He must have been glad to step on shore once more, for the cold winds and fierce storms to be met with at sea at that time of year made life on shipboard something of a hardship. Lawrence did not gain in health, and ere his wife could join him, he wrote to her that he would start for home. to his grave. He reached Mount Vernon in time to die 'neath his own roof with his kind friends at his bedside. His death took place on the 26th of July, 1752, when he was but 34 years of age. He had been like a father to George, and their hearts were bound by ties so strong and sweet that it was a great grief for them to part. But George had no time to sit down and mourn his loss. There was work for him to do. New cares were thrust on him by his brother's death, and that took up all his time and thoughts for some months, and he had to keep up his drills with the men at the school of arms, for which he was paid by the state.